She was selling paintings on the street, desperate to fund her chemo, ignored by most, fighting to stay alive. Then, a stranger stopped. It was Keanu Reeves. And what he did next left everyone speechless. But this wasn't just an act of kindness. It was the beginning of a miracle. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow, we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning air in downtown Los Angeles was crisp, the early sun casting long shadows over the sidewalks. A soft breeze tugged at the edges of Sophie Carter's woolen scarf as she carefully arranged the paintings on her tiny folding table. The 16-year-old's thin fingers trembled slightly from the cold, or maybe from something deeper. But her determination never wavered. Each canvas she displayed was a burst of color. Bold reds, calming blues, and golden hues that reflected a world far brighter than her own reality. Her mother, Maria Carter, knelt beside her, adjusting the easel that propped up Sophie's favorite piece, an abstract sunrise painted during her first round of chemo. Maria's face was tight with worry, her hands fussing with the tablecloth in silence. She glanced at Sophie, her eyes lingering a second longer than usual, as if memorizing her daughter's features. "You sure you're warm enough, sweetie?" Maria asked, gently smoothing down Sophie's knitted hat. Sophie smiled, thin but sincere. "I'm fine, Mom. We've got this." It was a brave front. Inside, Sophie's body ached in places she'd stopped acknowledging. She adjusted her scarf higher on her neck, more to hide the lingering cough she'd been fighting all morning than for warmth. Just 3 days earlier, they'd sat in Dr. Patel's office at the oncology clinic. The fluorescent lights had made everything feel colder, starker. Dr. Patel's kind eyes softened as he delivered the news Sophie had dreaded but already expected. "The next round of chemotherapy needs to start soon," Dr. Patel had said. "Your body is responding, but we have to stay aggressive." Maria had squeezed Sophie's hand. "And the cost?" Dr. Patel hesitated, glancing at the folder in front of him. "Insurance will cover a portion, but the remainder will still be significant. Tens of thousands." Maria's face had gone pale. Sophie, on the other hand, had taken a breath and made up her mind. "I'll sell my art," Sophie had said quietly but firmly. "People will understand. They'll help." Now, 3 days later, Sophie was on the sidewalk, putting that plan into action. The morning passed slowly. People strolled by, their coffee cups in hand, their conversations blending into white noise. Some glanced at Sophie's paintings, most didn't. The hours stretched, broken only by the shuffle of footsteps and the occasional gust of wind that rattled her display. At noon, an elderly couple approached. The woman, her silver hair pinned neatly back, smiled warmly at Sophie. "Did you paint these, dear?" she asked, leaning in to inspect the abstract sunrise. "Yes," Sophie answered, her voice soft but steady. "They're beautiful," the man said, nodding. "You've got talent." They chose a canvas of a tree with swirling golden leaves. Sophie had painted it during her first hospital stay, envisioning autumn outside her window. She'd priced it at $50, unsure if it was too much to hope for. The woman dug into her purse and pulled out the cash without hesitation. As she handed the bills to Sophie, she placed a gloved hand over the girl's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Good luck with everything," she said quietly. As they walked away, Sophie held the money in her hands for a moment, staring at it like it was something miraculous, her first glimmer of hope. By late afternoon, she'd sold 2 more small pieces, $150 in total. Not much, but it was a start. She felt a small swell of pride, and for a moment the gnawing exhaustion faded. Then a man in a leather jacket stopped in front of her table. He was middle-aged, rough around the edges, with a deep scowl carved into his face. He stared at the paintings for a long moment before snorting. "People only buy art from famous names," he muttered, not quite under his breath. "You're wasting your time, kid." Sophie felt the sting of his words, sharp and cold, but she refused to show it. Instead, she straightened in her chair, her spine stiff despite the ache radiating through her body. "I'm not giving up," she said softly, mostly to herself. He shrugged and walked on, disappearing into the crowd. Maria touched her daughter's shoulder gently, her expression a mixture of pride and heartbreak. The sky darkened with early evening and the chill deepened. Sophie packed her remaining paintings with slow, careful movements. Each one was like a piece of her, and she handled them with reverence. Maria folded the table and tucked it under one arm, while Sophie tucked the small wad of cash into her coat pocket. As they started toward the parking lot, Sophie coughed suddenly, pulling her scarf higher over her mouth to muffle the sound. Maria didn't miss it, her eyes flickering with concern, but she said nothing. They walked together in silence, Sophie leaning just slightly on her mother for support. Tired, yes. Weary, absolutely. But they had made progress. $150 closer. And tomorrow, they'd be back. As they reached their car, Sophie glanced up at the night sky. Somewhere, between the stars and the streetlights, she found the strength to smile. "Tomorrow will be better," she whispered. Maria squeezed her hand. "Yes, it will." And neither of them knew tomorrow was going to be the day everything changed. The days that followed were slow and unrelenting. Sophie Carter sat at her sidewalk art stand every morning, her small folding chair creaking beneath her thin frame as she arranged her paintings with careful precision. She never complained, not once, even though the mornings started colder and the days felt longer. Her fingers, stiff and aching from fatigue, worked steadily, arranging brushes and canvases in neat little rows, the sign her mother had made, reading "Original Artwork, Supporting My Chemo Journey," leaned at an angle against the table, the marker ink slightly smudged from morning dew. By day 4, the optimism Sophie had clung to was wearing thin. Sales were few and far between. The elderly couple from before had returned briefly to check on her, buying a second small painting for $30. A young mother with 2 small children bought a bright painting of sunflowers, but most people just glanced at Sophie's display and kept walking. Some offered polite smiles, others didn't even look. Each evening, Sophie counted her earnings carefully. $60 one day, $35 another. Every dollar mattered, but as she stared at the total in her mason jar, just over $700, she knew it wasn't nearly enough. Not for the treatments she needed. On the 6th day, Sophie's body felt heavier. The simple act of setting up her stand made her break into a cold sweat. Her mother, Maria, hovered nearby, worry etching lines into her face deeper with each passing hour. Sophie noticed her mother glancing at her more often now, as if waiting for her to collapse. By noon, Lucas arrived. His energy was like a jolt of light in Sophie's dimming world. Carrying 2 cups of hot cocoa, he grinned in his usual way, half serious, half sarcastic. "You look like you could use this," he said, offering her the warm cup. Sophie smiled weakly. "You have no idea." Lucas sat on the crate beside her, his jacket damp from the drizzle earlier that morning. He glanced at the people passing by, his brown eyes searching the crowd. "I told my mom about you selling your paintings," he said quietly. "She wants to come tomorrow and buy one." Sophie looked down, stirring her cocoa with a wooden stick. "Thanks, Lucas. You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted gently. "You're the bravest person I know." Her throat tightened, but she forced a smile. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. Later that afternoon, Sophie's phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering. It was Dr. Patel. "Hi, Dr. Patel," Sophie said softly. His voice was kind, but there was a weight to his words. "Sophie, I need to be honest with you. If we can't secure the funds for your next round of chemo soon, we'll have to delay it." She closed her eyes. "How long can we delay?" "Not long," Dr. Patel said gently. "You've been fighting hard, but this next round is critical." "Okay," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you." When she hung up, she stared at the tip jar sitting on the edge of the table. Coins rattled inside when the wind nudged it. It was nearly full, but nowhere near enough. She reached for her sketchbook, flipping to a blank page. Her hands trembled. but she pressed her pencil to the paper, sketching the outline of an eye. She shaded in every line slowly, thinking about how much she hated crying in front of people. By the 8th day, the skies opened up with heavy rain. Sophie sat beneath an umbrella, her paintings protected by clear plastic covers. The sidewalk was slick and shiny, reflecting the blurry reds and greens of the traffic lights overhead. Sophie's breath misted in the air, her fingers stiff on the pencil she held, even though she hadn't drawn for an hour. Her mother stood nearby, holding another umbrella over her head. "Honey," Maria said gently, "maybe we should call it a day. It's cold and you're exhausted." Sophie shook her head. "I'm not going home until I sell one more painting." Her voice was soft but steady. Maria sighed but didn't argue. She knew better by now. Hours passed. The rain slowed, then stopped. The streets gleamed as the city lights flickered to life, illuminating the wet pavement with golden halos. Sophie leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She was so tired. Her bones ached. Her head throbbed. She coughed into her scarf and bit her lip, trying to will the pain away. It was then she heard them. Footsteps. Slow, steady, heavy boots that thudded softly against the wet concrete. Sophie opened her eyes slowly. A man stood there, tall and familiar. His black leather jacket was damp from the rain. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead. His face was calm, his eyes kind but unreadable. "These are beautiful," he said in a deep, even voice. Sophie blinked, certain for a moment that she was hallucinating, but she wasn't. It was really him. Keanu Reeves. For a long second she couldn't find her voice. She stared, mouth slightly open. Keanu crouched down to look more closely at her paintings. He studied them carefully, taking his time, as if he had nowhere else to be. His fingertips hovered over a canvas of a tree in full bloom. "You painted all these?" he asked. Sophie nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." Her mother stepped forward wide-eyed but said nothing. "They're really good," Keanu said. "You have a gift." Sophie swallowed hard. "Thank you." Keanu's gaze shifted to the sign on the table. "Supporting my chemo journey." There was no pity in his expression, only respect. He stood up, pulling his wallet from his jacket pocket. "I'd like to buy this one," he said, pointing to the blooming tree. "It's $200, Sophie said quickly, embarrassed by how small it sounded. Keanu smiled faintly. He pulled out his checkbook instead of cash. Sophie watched in stunned silence as he wrote. When he handed her the check, she stared at the numbers. $50,000. Her breath hitched. She looked up at him, unable to speak. "For the painting," Keanu said gently. "And because you're brave." Sophie's mother gasped softly behind her. Sophie clutched the check to her chest, tears filling her eyes. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied. "Just keep painting." And with that he gave them both a small nod and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Sophie's world forever changed. For a moment, Sophie Carter thought she was dreaming. She blinked slowly, willing her exhausted mind to focus on what was happening right in front of her. But it was no dream. Keanu Reeves was really there, standing in front of her modest sidewalk art stand like any other customer. Except he wasn't any other customer. He was the kind of person who filled movie screens and inspired millions. Yet here he was, looking intently at her paintings, a quiet curiosity in his dark eyes. He wasn't wearing anything flashy. No designer labels, no sunglasses to hide behind. Just a plain black jacket over a t-shirt, jeans slightly faded, and well-worn boots that thudded gently on the wet sidewalk. There was no entourage, no bodyguards, no reporters, just him and her. Sophie's heart thundered in her chest. She felt suddenly aware of everything: the dampness in the air, the lingering ache in her fingers, the tightness in her lungs from holding back her coughs. She watched him delicately lift one of her canvases, the painting of the blooming tree. It was one she had worked on during her last round of chemotherapy, trying to focus on life and color instead of needles and nausea. Keanu held it carefully, his thumb brushing lightly along the edge of the frame. His expression wasn't polite curiosity, it was sincere. He was studying it, seeing it. Sophie scrambled to find her voice. "It's $200, she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. Keanu's gaze shifted to her, warm but steady. He smiled faintly, as though her words meant something deeper to him than she understood. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie," she replied, her breath catching. "Sophie Carter." Keanu nodded slowly. "You're very talented, Sophie." For reasons she couldn't explain, tears stung her eyes. Maybe it was the way he said her name, or maybe it was because he made her feel seen, not as a sick kid on a sidewalk, but as an artist. She wiped quickly at her cheek. I'm selling my paintings to help pay for my chemotherapy," she said quietly. "Insurance doesn't cover everything, and I didn't want my mom to sell the house or anything, so I thought maybe people would want to buy something beautiful." Her voice trailed off, the lump in her throat threatening to stop her from speaking at all. Her mother, standing silently beside her, squeezed her hand in quiet support. Keanu didn't react the way most people did. There was no pity in his face, no furrowed brow or forced platitudes. He simply nodded as though he understood something most people didn't, as though he respected her for fighting in the only way she knew how. Without another word, he tucked the painting carefully under his arm, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a checkbook, flipping it open with casual precision. Sophie watched in stunned silence as he scribbled something down. It wasn't until he held out the check toward her that she realized what he had done. She reached out, her hand trembling as she took the piece of paper. She glanced down at it, expecting to see $200 written in neat handwriting. But it wasn't $200. It was $50,000. Her breath left her in a soft gasp. She stared at the numbers, her vision blurring as tears welled up again, this time impossible to hold back. She blinked rapidly, making sure she wasn't hallucinating, but the check was real. Keanu Reeves had just bought one of her paintings. For $50,000. "For the painting," Keanu said softly, "and because I believe in you." Sophie looked up at him, completely speechless. Her mother pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. Neither of them could move for a moment, frozen by the weight of the gesture. It wasn't just the money. It was the dignity with which he gave it. Keanu gave them both a small nod. "Keep painting," he said, "and take care of yourself." He turned then, slipping the checkbook back into his jacket pocket, and began to walk away, his boots scuffing softly on the wet pavement. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't pose for photos or make a big show of it. He just walked away. Sophie and her mother stood there, staring after him until he disappeared down the street, vanishing into the quiet of the city night, as though he had never been there at all. And yet, everything had changed. "Sophie!" a voice called from behind them. She turned quickly, wiping at her eyes. Lucas was hurrying across the sidewalk toward her, a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a grin on his face. But the moment he saw her expression and the check she still held in her trembling hands, his pace slowed. "What happened?" he asked, breathless. Sophie could barely speak. She held up the check, her lips parted as though the words were still catching in her throat. Lucas took it gently from her hand, scanning the numbers with wide eyes. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Sophie, is this real?" She nodded slowly, her legs giving out as she sank down onto her folding chair. Her mother crouched beside her, tears running freely down her face now. Lucas laughed in disbelief, his joy infectious. He wrapped his arms around Sophie tightly, careful not to squeeze too hard, but unable to hide his excitement. "You did it," he said. "You did it." "No," Sophie whispered, clutching the check to her chest again. "He did." Lucas shook his head. "No, you earned this. He just saw it." Across the street, a young woman with a notepad tucked beneath her arm and a pen poised in midair stood watching. The journalist, who had passed by earlier and overheard Sophie's story, scribbled furiously, capturing every moment, her camera phone clicking softly as she took discreet photos. She knew this was more than a human interest piece. This was something special, something rare. As Lucas helped pack up Sophie's paintings for the night, the weight of exhaustion seemed lighter. Her mother's hands, so often shaking with worry, were steady now, and Sophie felt hope again. The street was quiet, but inside her heart, it was as if the entire world had opened up. The morning after Keanu Reeves' visit felt surreal for Sophie Carter. She woke up in her small bedroom to the sounds of her phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand. Messages, alerts, notifications, all flashing relentlessly, buzzing louder than the persistent city traffic beyond her window. At first, Sophie thought it might be another appointment reminder from Dr. Patel's office, or maybe a text from Lucas. But as she blinked away the remnants of sleep and picked up her phone, she realized something extraordinary had happened. Her Instagram app was flooded with follows and comments. Overnight, she had gained more than 500 new followers, and they just kept coming. Each time she refreshed the page, the number grew. Messages poured in from strangers across the country and beyond, offering encouragement, sharing stories, and asking if they could buy her artwork. The headline that was being shared everywhere read, "Keanu Reeves changes teen's life with $50,000 art purchase." Sophie's heart raced as she scrolled through article after article. The journalist, who had quietly stood nearby the night before, had published the first piece. It had spread like wildfire, picked up by local stations, then national ones. Photos of her sidewalk stand, her vibrant paintings, and even one of her and Keanu, captured from behind as he handed her the check, were all over the internet. Her phone rang again, and this time it was Lucas. "You're famous," he shouted as soon as she answered. "Have you seen it? You're everywhere." Sophie laughed, overwhelmed. I don't even know what to think." Lucas was still breathless. "Camden Walsh from Channel 8 messaged me. They want to do a segment on you, a live interview." Sophie's stomach flipped. Channel 8 was the biggest local station. Camden Walsh was the reporter everyone respected, sharp, fair, but kind. She couldn't believe this was happening. "Me? On TV?" she whispered. "Yes, come on, you need to do this," Lucas insisted. "The world's watching, Soph." The rest of the morning was a blur. Calls from media outlets, messages from people wanting to support her, emails from art galleries requesting meetings. She could barely process any of it. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, still trying to accept it herself. Tears welled in her mom's eyes every time she read another message of support. By the time Camden Walsh and a small camera crew arrived at their apartment that afternoon, Sophie was nervous but determined. She wore her favorite scarf, the one with tiny paint stains at the edges, and sat on the worn-out couch where she had spent so many nights sketching by lamplight. Camden was warm and professional, her tone gentle as she asked about Sophie's art and her battle with cancer. "I didn't think anyone would really notice," Sophie admitted during the interview, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I just wanted to sell enough paintings to help my mom with the bills." Camden smiled, and then Keanu Reeves noticed. Sophie smiled back, her cheeks flushing. And everything changed. The segment aired that night. Camden's voiceover narrated Sophie's story over clips of her sidewalk stand, close-ups of her paintings, and that incredible moment where Keanu handed her the check. It was respectful, heartfelt, and it struck a chord. People didn't just watch, they acted. Donations began pouring in through a fundraiser Camden had linked in the segment. People from all over the world contributed. Some donated $5, some donated hundreds. One anonymous donor gave $10,000, and with every donation, there was a message of hope. "You inspire me. You're not alone. Keep fighting." By the third day, Sophie's small fundraiser had raised over $250,000. Her paintings, every single one of them, sold out in 2 days. Orders for prints flooded her inbox, and Lucas helped her set up a website to handle the demand. She had gone from selling 1 or 2 paintings a day to needing a waiting list for future commissions. Her Instagram following skyrocketed. From 300 followers before Keanu's visit, she now had over 500,000. Artists, celebrities, and even cancer survivors shared her story on their pages. Art magazines requested interviews. A downtown gallery reached out, offering Sophie her first exhibition. Sophie was still adjusting when Dr. Patel called. "Good news," he said. "Your treatment can start right away, and you're paid in full." Sophie froze, gripping the phone tightly. "All of it?" "All of it," Dr. Patel confirmed, his voice filled with relief. "We can begin as soon as you're ready." Sophie dropped her head into her hands. She was ready. Fine. Her mom stood behind her, rubbing her shoulders gently. They didn't say anything for a while. They didn't need to. That same afternoon, as Sophie worked on a thank you post for all her new followers, a flower delivery arrived at their door. The card was simple. From Melissa Hargrove and everyone at Maple Creek Diner. "Keanu changed my life too. We're cheering for you." Sophie smiled, remembering the news story Lucas had shared with her the week before about the diner, how Keanu's kindness had changed a town. Now she was part of that story too. Later that evening, Keanu Reeves reposted Camden's news segment on his social media. His caption was simple: "Support artists, support fighters." It wasn't flashy, it wasn't self-congratulatory, it was Keanu. Quiet, humble, sincere. Sophie's page exploded again. Celebrities reposted Keanu's message. Messages came in from artists, schools, and hospitals. The world had rallied behind her because Keanu believed in her, but now they believed in her too. At dinner that night, Lucas nudged her phone across the table. It was buzzing with another message. "You're trending worldwide," he grinned. "You're unstoppable." Sophie laughed, a real belly-deep laugh she hadn't felt in months. "I'm not sure I'm ready for all this." Lucas shrugged. "Too late." The next morning, Sophie stood in front of the gallery owner who had offered her the solo exhibition. She held her newest painting, a portrait of the tree from her sidewalk stand, only now it was in full bloom, branches reaching out as though they were embracing the world. "You're sure you want this one in the show?" the gallery owner asked. Sophie nodded. "It's the one that changed everything." The sound of beeping monitors was steady and rhythmic, a strange comfort in an otherwise sterile hospital room. Sophie Carter sat cross-legged in a recliner, a soft blanket pulled over her lap as the IV line ran steadily into her arm. But instead of focusing on the needle or the faint sting in her veins, she focused on the sketchbook resting on her knees. Her pencil moved slowly, shakily at times, but it moved. The picture she was working on was simple. A tree with sprawling roots, twisting upward into branches that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the page. The roots were thick, grounded deep in the earth, while the branches bloomed with bursts of color. Vibrant reds, yellows, blues. She called it resilient. Lucas sat in the chair beside her, balancing a tray of untouched hospital jello in one hand and scrolling through his phone with the other. Every so often, he'd glance over at Sophie's drawing and whistle. "That's insane," he said for maybe the 5th time that morning. "Seriously, Soph, when this is done, that needs to go on the gallery wall." Sophie smiled faintly, her lips pale but her eyes bright. "Maybe," she whispered, though there was a spark in her gaze that said she knew it would. Treatment had begun 2 weeks ago. The fear she once felt, that they wouldn't be able to afford it, that she wouldn't get this chance, had faded. It was replaced by something stronger: purpose. Every time she walked through the doors of the oncology wing, sketchbook under one arm, she reminded herself why she was fighting. Her art booth had given her purpose. Keanu Reeves' unexpected act of kindness had given her hope, and the tidal wave of support that followed, that gave her strength. Letters arrived daily, Boxes filled with colored pencils, markers, and watercolor sets were delivered to her hospital room, many from children her age who had heard her story. Some had been patients themselves. They wrote things like, "I believe in you, Sophie. You inspired me to start painting again. Keep making art. You're helping more people than you know." She pinned every letter to the corkboard in her room. Her mom called it her wall of hope. Sophie called it proof. Her mother was a constant presence at her side, though these days she smiled more easily. She had been so weighed down by fear for months, fear of losing Sophie, fear of debts, of what came next. But now, there was a lightness to her. She sat in the armchair across from Sophie, knitting a scarf in shades of yellow and green, colors Sophie had picked out. "Guess I'll have to teach you how to do this next," her mom said one afternoon. Sophie had chuckled softly. "Maybe after I finish this tree." Then one day, without warning or announcement, Keanu Reeves appeared. He arrived at the hospital wearing a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses, a plain gray hoodie and jeans. There was no entourage, no cameras. Just Keanu, walking through the door of Sophie's hospital room like an old friend stopping by to catch up. Lucas's jaw nearly hit the floor. "Is this really happening?" he muttered under his breath. Keanu smiled, removed his sunglasses, and nodded at Sophie. "Hey," he said softly, as if he were trying not to disturb the calm of the room. Sophie blinked up at him, stunned. You came?" "I said I would," he replied. He glanced around the room at the artwork pinned to the walls, at the sketchbook still balanced on her knees. "You've been busy." Sophie tried to speak but found herself at a loss. Keanu's eyes softened. He pulled out a chair and sat down next to her, setting a small sketch pad on the table between them. "I thought maybe you'd let me draw with you," he said. For the next hour, Sophie and Keanu sketched side by side. He wasn't a master artist, but his drawings had a simplicity and charm to them. He doodled a tree that was crooked and messy but full of character. Sophie laughed when he showed it to her, and he laughed along with her. They didn't talk about her illness, they didn't talk about the treatment or the fight. They talked about art, about how art made people feel seen, how it helped people understand one another. "You've already helped more people than you realize," Keanu told her at one point, "and you'll keep helping them." He stayed for nearly 2 hours before quietly excusing himself. Before he left, he handed Sophie his sketch of that lopsided, charming tree and said, "Every artist starts somewhere." Sophie kept the sketch in her journal. It was now one of her most prized possessions. Weeks passed and Sophie grew stronger. Her hair thinned, but she didn't mind. Her energy flagged, but she sketched every day. Lucas made sure she drank enough water and ate, even when she didn't feel like it. Her mother braided what was left of her hair into a tiny, stubborn braid each morning. "This is your battle braid," she said. "We'll grow it back later." The gallery opening arrived in early spring. Sophie wore a simple dress and the yellow and green scarf her mother had finished knitting. Her arms were thin, but her eyes glowed with excitement. The downtown gallery buzzed with energy as people wandered in and out, admiring her paintings, prints, and sketches hung on clean white walls. Every piece had a story, every brushstroke was part of her journey. Keanu was there too, standing quietly at the back of the room. No cameras, no crowds, just him, watching as Sophie spoke with buyers, signed prints, and smiled at people thanking her for her courage. The elderly couple from her first day at the sidewalk stand showed up, holding hands as they admired her newest works. "We knew you had something special," the woman whispered as they bought another piece. "You've come so far," the man added. Sophie beamed. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. As the evening wore on, Sophie took the microphone and addressed the room. She spoke of hope, of the power of one small act of kindness. "This isn't just about me," she told the crowd. "This is about every kid out there fighting something hard. Every artist trying to be seen." Then she made her announcement. A portion of the night's proceeds would go to start her foundation, Colors of Hope. "It's for young artists battling illness," she explained. We'll help them buy supplies, pay for lessons, or even just give them a place to share their work." The room erupted in applause. Keanu clapped too, his quiet smile more than enough for Sophie. Their eyes met across the crowd, and he nodded once. Proud. After the event, Sophie stood in the gallery's small courtyard, breathing in the fresh evening air. Lucas was at her side, munching on a plate of hors d'oeuvres he'd snuck from the buffet. "You did good," he said through a mouthful of crackers. Sophie laughed. "We did good." As they walked back into the gallery, Keanu was waiting by the door. "You're making the world a better place," he told her. Sophie's voice was steady. "So are you." And they shook hands, artist to artist. Sophie Carter never expected the world to care about her small paintings. She never expected the world to care about her at all. But in the weeks following her gallery opening, something incredible began to happen. Her foundation, Colors of Hope, became more than just a name scribbled in her sketchbook or an idea whispered to Lucas one sleepless night in the hospital. It became a movement. It started small. A letter arrived from another young artist named Mia, a girl Sophie had never met. She was 12 and battling leukemia in Ohio. Mia enclosed a drawing of a bright yellow sunflower and a note that read, "You made me believe I can be an artist too." Sophie pinned it to her bedroom wall, right next to Keanu Reeves' sketch of the crooked tree. Then came another letter, and another. Soon the mailbox outside her family's house was stuffed daily with envelopes, some thick with art prints, some folded tightly with crayon drawings. Kids from all over the world were sending her their dreams. Sophie smiled through tears as she and Lucas unpacked every letter at the dining room table. Her mom took pictures of the piles of artwork, promising to create an album titled The Colors of Hope Collection. By the end of the month, Colors of Hope had launched an online platform where young artists battling illness could upload and showcase their work. Sophie and Lucas worked tirelessly to review every submission, post messages of encouragement, and share stories on their growing social media accounts. Their Instagram account, once a quiet feed of Sophie's paintings, exploded with life. Portraits from young artists in Brazil, street scenes from teens in France, and abstract sketches from kids in small towns like Maple Creek. Lucas, now self-proclaimed campaign manager, added bio descriptions, replied to messages, and kept track of donations rolling in. "We need a whole team," Lucas joked one evening as they sorted through emails. "We are a whole team," Sophie replied, tapping away at her laptop, her face lit with quiet determination. The media, sensing the ripple effect Sophie's story was causing, followed closely. Camden Walsh from Channel 8 returned to film a documentary on Sophie and the impact of Colors of Hope. His camera captured everything, from Sophie teaching a virtual art class at the hospital to her speaking at art schools and children's wards across the country. The documentary was titled Brushstrokes of Bravery. It aired nationally and quickly became one of the network's highest-rated broadcasts of the year. And it wasn't just children or hospitals taking notice. Keanu Reeves, as always, remained in the background, quiet, humble. But Sophie's foundation noticed an anonymous donation that covered an entire year's operating expenses. The bank transfer simply read, "For Colors of Hope. Support the artists." Sophie knew immediately who had sent it. She sat on her bed that night, sketchbook in her lap, and wrote Keanu a letter in her neat, looping handwriting. "Dear Keanu, you believed in me before the world did. You gave me hope when I didn't know if I could keep going. Because of you, there are children painting today who never thought they'd be able to hold a brush again. Thank you for showing me that one act of kindness can ripple outward forever." She slipped the letter into an envelope and mailed it the next morning. A week later, a small package arrived. Inside was a folded piece of sketch paper. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The drawing was simple. Two hands, one much larger than the other, holding a paintbrush together. Sophie smiled as she pinned it beside Mia's sunflower. As Colors of Hope expanded, Sophie knew she wanted to give back in an even more direct way. So, she planned a special event, an outdoor sidewalk art fair, just like the one where her story had begun. Lucas and her mother helped arrange permits for the plaza downtown. They set up tents and easels, invited young artists from across the state, and advertised the event as the Colors of Hope Street Festival. Sophie was nervous the night before. "What if no one comes?" she asked quietly. Lucas grinned. "What if everyone does?" And they did. The plaza was packed from morning until sunset. Families strolled through rows of paintings and crafts, stopping to talk with artists, many of whom were survivors like Sophie. Music played, food trucks lined the streets, and laughter echoed between the buildings. It wasn't long before Sophie noticed a familiar face helping set up one of the booths. Jesse. He'd been one of the bikers from the Iron Serpents, the gang Keanu had faced in Maple Creek months before. But he wasn't wearing a leather jacket now. Instead, he wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, holding a box of paint supplies as he set up canvases for the kids. "Jesse?" Sophie approached him cautiously. He turned, smiling. "Hey, thought I'd help out. Keanu said this was where I'd find something better to do." Sophie laughed. "I'm glad you're here." Later that day, Sophie took her spot in front of an easel by the sidewalk, not to sell, but to teach. Children gathered around, clutching brushes in tiny hands, their eyes wide with excitement. "Pick a color that makes you feel strong," Sophie instructed them gently. A girl chose blue, a boy chose orange. Another girl picked green. They painted trees, stars, and abstract swirls. They painted hope. Sophie crouched down beside one little boy who was struggling to keep his brush steady. His hand trembled the way hers used to. "You're doing great," she whispered, placing her hand over his gently to guide him. He looked up at her with shy eyes. "It's not perfect." "It doesn't have to be," Sophie said. "It just has to be yours." Camden filmed the entire interaction, wiping his eyes behind the camera lens. By the time the festival ended, Colors of Hope had raised enough funds to send art kits to over 500 children in hospitals nationwide. At home that night, exhausted but content, Sophie sat with Lucas and her mom on the back porch. The stars glittered above them. "We did this," Lucas said, nudging Sophie's shoulder. "No," Sophie corrected gently. "We all did." A few weeks later, Sophie was invited to speak at a national arts education conference in Chicago. She stood in front of hundreds of teachers, artists, and advocates. Her voice was strong now, clear. "I was just a kid with a sketchbook," she told them. "And then one person stopped and believed in me. And because of him, I'm standing here today." In the front row, Dr. Patel sat beaming. Afterward, he hugged her tightly. "I call this a miracle helped by art and kindness," he said with a tear in his eye. By summer's end, Sophie's health had stabilized. Her doctors called it remission, but Sophie called it a second chance. And on a warm afternoon, just like the one when it all began, Sophie returned to the sidewalk in downtown LA. She unfolded a chair, set up a small easel, but this time she wasn't selling her work. She was teaching a free painting class for anyone who wanted to learn. Kids gathered at her feet, brushes ready. Lucas leaned against a lamppost, watching proudly. Her mom brought them lemonade. And as Sophie guided a little girl's hand across the canvas, she thought of Keanu's drawing. The two hands holding a paintbrush together. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's make something beautiful." The sun was warm that afternoon, bright golden rays stretching across the quiet street where Sophie Carter had once set up her art stand out of sheer desperation. A year ago, she was frail, uncertain, sitting in the cold, clutching onto fading hope as she tried to sell her paintings to pay for chemotherapy. Today, the scene was different. The sidewalk was alive with color and laughter. Sophie stood in the exact same spot, but now she was strong. Her dark hair had begun to grow back in soft curls beneath her straw sun hat. Her skin, once pale from treatments, glowed with warmth. Her eyes sparkled with the energy of someone who had weathered the storm and come through brighter. On either side of her, easels stood in neat rows. Children from struggling families, many of whom had never held a paintbrush before, dipped their brushes into pots of bright colors. They giggled as they painted trees, stars, and wild shapes across paper canvases. Some made messy splatters, others delicate strokes, but all of them were smiling. Sophie knelt beside a young boy who was painting the sky in swirls of purple. "That's beautiful," she said gently. He glanced up. "You think so?" "I know so," she replied, her voice full of certainty. Her mother sat nearby on a bench, watching the scene with quiet pride. Every now and then, she wiped at her eyes with a tissue, though her smile never faded. Just a year ago, she had feared losing her daughter. Now, she was witnessing her daughter inspire dozens of other children. A familiar voice broke Sophie's focus. "Didn't I tell you this sidewalk has magic?" Sophie turned toward the voice, and her heart did a small flip. Keanu Reeves stood at the edge of the gathering, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Dressed simply as always, dark jeans, boots dusty from the road, he looked every bit the quiet legend he was. But in that moment, he was just Keanu, the man who had believed in her when no one else had. "Keanu!" Sophie greeted him, a grin breaking over her face as she rose to her feet. The children glanced up, eyes wide with recognition, but Keanu raised a hand, a gentle gesture. "Don't stop painting on my account," he said softly, and the kids quickly returned to their work, whispering among themselves with excitement. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over the artwork hung on display and the vibrant colors spread across the sidewalk. "You did it," he said, his voice warm with admiration. Sophie nodded. "We did." Without fanfare or ceremony, he sat down cross-legged on the pavement beside her. Sophie hesitated only a moment before settling next to him, legs crossed, just like the kids. An easel stood empty in front of them, a blank canvas waiting. Sophie handed him a brush. "Feel like painting?" Keanu smiled. "Always." They sat together in companionable silence, dipping their brushes into the colors. Keanu painted slow, deliberate strokes, trees and mountains, calm landscapes. Sophie added her own touches, stars in the sky, splashes of light where sunlight might break through the clouds. It wasn't about creating something perfect. It was about creating something together. Across the square, Camden Walsh stood with his camera crew. But today there was no interview, no headline-grabbing moment. He kept his distance, zooming in softly to capture the quiet magic of the scene. Two people painting side by side, surrounded by laughter and color. Talia Reynolds, from another town, another story, arrived carrying a tray of lemonade. She was the same woman who had once watched Keanu change an entire town with a single act of grace. "Lemonade for the artists," she called cheerfully. The kids cheered. Talia handed out cups with practiced ease, pausing to squeeze Sophie's shoulder as she passed. "This is incredible," she whispered. Sophie smiled. "It's home now." As the sun began its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the scene, Keanu reached into the messenger bag slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a small package, wrapped simply in brown paper and tied with twine. He handed it to Sophie without a word. Curious, she untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a leather sketchbook, soft, rich brown leather with smooth pages inside. But what made her breath catch was the engraving on the front cover. Sophie Carter, dreamer and creator. Keanu met her eyes. "Fill it with dreams," he said quietly. Sophie blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. She ran her hand over the leather, feeling the weight of his words. "I already am," she whispered, with a shaky laugh. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The children finished their paintings one by one, proudly holding them up for their parents or siblings to admire. Some were simple, some surprisingly complex, but every one of them was a masterpiece, because it was theirs. As dusk deepened, Sophie's mom gathered up the finished pieces to hang on a line strung between two lampposts, creating an impromptu gallery. People walking by stopped to admire the art. Some took photos, others simply stood in awe. Keanu watched it all quietly, nodding to himself. "It's good work," he murmured. Sophie turned to him. You were the first person who made me believe it was." They sat for a while longer, finishing their collaborative painting. It wasn't polished or perfect, but it was theirs, a piece of the journey they had shared, from sidewalk despair to sidewalk joy. As the crowd slowly thinned out and families gathered their children to head home, Sophie stood and stretched. Her legs were stiff, but her heart was light. Keanu stood too, brushing the dust off his jeans. "Back to work tomorrow?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Always." Talia approached again, snapping one last photo of the two of them standing in front of the finished canvas. "Mind if we hang this one in the diner?" she asked with a grin. Sophie laughed. "Only if you promise to serve lemonade with every painting." "Deal," Talia replied. As Keanu prepared to leave, he shook hands with Sophie's mom, who hugged him gratefully. "Thank you," she said simply. Keanu smiled. She did all the hard work. He turned back to Sophie. "See you again?" "Definitely," she said. He gave her a final nod, then disappeared down the sidewalk, melting into the city like he always did. Sophie watched him go, the leather sketchbook clutched to her chest. Camden approached quietly. "That was something," he murmured. "It was," Sophie agreed, smiling softly. "Mind if I use this for the ending shot?" he asked, pointing to the crowd of children still laughing and playing nearby. Sophie nodded. "Only if you show this," she said, holding up the sketchbook. "The dreams are just beginning." Camden smiled, adjusting his lens. As the camera panned out, the scene settled into something timeless. Families gathered under string lights, children painted in brilliant colors. Sophie stood at the center of it all, smiling, alive, hopeful. And the town that once walked by without noticing her now stood together in celebration of what hope and kindness could build. The gallery lights glowed softly against the crisp white walls, illuminating rows of vibrant paintings. They were bold, alive, and full of stories of survival, hope, and resilience. At the center of the gallery's entrance, carved into a polished wooden plaque, was the title of the exhibit, Light in the Dark. It was Sophie Carter's first solo gallery show. Just over a year ago, she had sat quietly on a street corner, sketching as her body ached from exhaustion, desperately trying to sell a few paintings to pay for life-saving treatment. Now she stood tall and confident, greeting guests who had come from all over the country to witness her work. The gallery was packed. Reporters mingled with art enthusiasts, doctors, and cancer survivors who found solace in Sophie's pieces. Every painting had a small handwritten note next to it explaining its meaning. Some were dark, born from moments of fear and pain. Others exploded with color, representations of hope rediscovered. At the far end of the room, quietly watching from the shadows, stood Keanu Reeves. As always, he had slipped in without ceremony, dressed in his trademark simplicity, black jeans, boots, and a dark blazer. He stood with his hands tucked loosely in his pockets. His expression was soft, calm, but there was a glimmer of pride in his eyes as he watched Sophie move through the crowd. Sophie caught sight of him briefly. She smiled, offering him a small nod, one of gratitude and quiet understanding. Keanu returned the nod and stayed back, letting her shine. This was her night. When Camden Walsh arrived, camera crew in tow, Sophie greeted him warmly. "I promised you the first interview," she joked. Camden chuckled. "I'm honored. But tonight's about your voice, Sophie. You don't need me to tell this story anymore." They stood together for a moment, watching the flow of guests admiring the artwork. Camden's book, Brushstrokes of Hope, had just hit the bestseller list. It chronicled Sophie's journey, her diagnosis, her fight, and the miracle of a stranger's kindness that turned everything around. But Camden was quick to tell anyone who asked that the real hero was Sophie. Proceeds from Sophie's exhibit were already pledged to something deeply personal, the funding of a new pediatric wing at Dr. Patel's hospital. Sophie had insisted on naming it the Colors of Hope Pediatric Center. It was a place where young patients, much like herself a year ago, would not only receive treatment but also have an art room to express their feelings, just as she had done during her own darkest days. Dr. Patel was there that night, standing quietly in front of a piece Sophie had painted of the hospital room where they first met. Tears glistened in his eyes as he read her caption aloud. "This was where I learned how to fight. Thank you for helping me find my light." As the evening wore on, guests moved from painting to painting, asking Sophie questions, telling her how inspired they were by her journey. Some were parents with their own children battling illness. Some were artists who had almost given up on their dreams. And through it all, Sophie was gracious, humble, and filled with a deep sense of purpose. Later that night, she found a quiet corner where Lucas was waiting with her mother. Her mother wrapped her arms around Sophie in a warm hug. Lucas, always the jokester, grinned as he handed her a glass of sparkling water. Famous artist, best-selling author's muse, and hospital benefactor. "Anything else on your resume?" he teased. Sophie laughed softly. "TED speaker," she replied with a playful wink. A week later, Sophie took the stage at one of the most prestigious TED events of the year. She stood confidently under the bright lights in a simple navy dress, her curly hair tucked behind her ears. The room was silent as she began to speak. She told them about the fear, the nights she lay awake wondering if she'd live to see another birthday, the days she sat on cold pavement, hoping someone would buy a piece of her art. She spoke about rejection, exhaustion, and doubt. And then she spoke about a man who had stopped, listened, and changed everything, not because he had to, but because he believed in her. She held up Keanu's sketch, the simple drawing he had sent her of two hands holding a paintbrush. "Sometimes, one person's belief can create a masterpiece," she said softly. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from the weight of truth. The audience rose in a standing ovation as she closed with her final message. "Kindness isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength we have." Afterward, her mother and Lucas met her backstage, embracing her tightly. She could see the pride shining in their eyes. "You nailed it," Lucas whispered. Her mother just kissed her forehead. "You've changed the world." Somewhere miles away, Keanu Reeves watched the live stream on his laptop. He was sitting in a quiet hotel room between filming locations. He smiled faintly as he watched Sophie hold up his sketch and speak those powerful words. He didn't need recognition, he didn't want it, but knowing he had played a small role in helping someone find their light, that was enough. Back in Maple Creek, the small park named after Eliza Reynolds and Mama Beverly was filled with families laughing under the sun. The diner that had once rejected Keanu now welcomed everyone. Talia Reynolds had hung one of Sophie's prints behind the counter, with a quote from Sophie's TED Talk beneath it. "Kindness changes everything." As Sophie's gallery exhibit closed that night, she stood at the door thanking each guest personally. When the room finally emptied, she took a deep breath and looked around. She walked to the far wall where Keanu's collaborative painting from their sidewalk art day hung proudly. A small engraved plaque below it read, "Hope begins with a brushstroke." Sophie placed her hand over the plaque and smiled. Her life had changed forever, not because of a handout, but because someone believed she could stand on her own and create something lasting. And now, she was doing the same for others. As she left the gallery that night, Lucas beside her and her mother locking up behind them, Sophie glanced up at the sky. The stars shimmered brightly, clear and strong. She pulled Keanu's sketchbook from her bag and flipped to the next blank page. There was still so much more to create, and she was just getting started. The story of Sophie Carter didn't begin with fame or fortune. It began with quiet determination on a sidewalk, where her fragile hands arranged paintings that held her hope, strength, and dreams. It was a simple act of courage, from a young girl fighting to survive in a world that had given her every reason to give up. But she didn't. She believed that somewhere, someone would stop, notice, and care. When Keanu Reeves crossed her path that rainy afternoon, he could have walked by, like so many others had. He could have looked away, pretended not to see. But instead, he paused. He looked at her work, at the young woman behind it, and truly listened. And in that moment, he chose to act. He didn't act out of pity or obligation. He acted out of belief. By writing that check for $50,000, Keanu didn't just help Sophie afford chemotherapy. He gave her something more powerful than money. He gave her validation. He told her, without needing many words, that she mattered, that her art mattered, that her life mattered. And that single act of kindness became the turning point in Sophie's life. It wasn't long before the world learned of Sophie's story. People came from miles away to buy her paintings, to meet the girl who refused to give up. Donations poured in. Her medical expenses were covered. Her treatments began immediately, and the odds that once seemed stacked against her slowly shifted. Her health improved, but so did her spirit, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just fighting alone. Sophie didn't let the help she received stop with herself. She used the platform she was given to create something bigger, something lasting. Colors of Hope was born not as a charity, but as a movement that invited young artists from around the world, many of them battling their own illnesses, to share their work, their stories, and their dreams. Sophie made it her mission to give others what Keanu had given her: belief. At her first gallery exhibit, she didn't take center stage to talk about herself. She spoke about the power of compassion. She spoke about how the smallest gesture, a smile, a kind word, a hand extended at the right moment, can change everything. She knew this because it had happened to her. In time, Sophie's health stabilized. Her remission was declared a miracle by her doctors. But Sophie called it something else: a gift of kindness. Her story was told on stages and television screens. Camden Walsh's documentary touched millions of lives. Schools invited her to speak to young students about resilience, creativity, and hope. And through it all, Keanu remained in the background. He didn't seek praise or attention, but he never stopped believing in Sophie. He visited her gallery openings quietly. He watched her TED Talk from afar. He sent handwritten notes of encouragement. He donated anonymously to Colors of Hope, knowing the impact wasn't measured in headlines, but in lives changed. What this story teaches us is simple. Kindness, no matter how small it may seem, has the power to ripple out in ways we can't even begin to imagine. When Keanu reached out his hand to Sophie, he didn't just help her pay for her treatment. He helped restore her faith in humanity. He gave her strength she didn't know she had, and in doing so, he helped her change the lives of countless others. That's the lesson we should carry with us. It's not about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about seeing someone who needs help and deciding to act. It's about lifting someone up when they are too tired to stand on their own. It's about choosing compassion over indifference. Whether you are a famous actor or a passerby on the street, you have the power to make a difference. Kindness doesn't just heal individuals. It heals communities. It restores hope in places where hope feels impossible. And it starts with one act, one moment of courage, one person who says, "I believe in you." As Sophie once said in her TED Talk, holding up the simple sketch Keanu gave her, sometimes one person's belief can create a masterpiece. The story of Sophie Carter and Keanu Reeves reminds us that life is not about the battles we face alone. It's about the connections we build and the ways we lift each other up. Forgiveness, compassion, and empathy are not signs of weakness. They are the greatest strengths we can have. As you finish this story, think about the people in your life who might need a little belief, a little hope, a little kindness. Be that person. You don't need fame or fortune to change a life. You just need a heart that's willing to care. Sophie's life today is a reflection of that belief. She continues to paint, she continues to teach, she continues to inspire. Her Colors of Hope Foundation has helped dozens of young artists find their voice and their strength. And she never forgets where it started. One act of kindness, one belief, one masterpiece. If this incredible story inspired you, if you believe in the power of kindness and hope, we invite you to take action. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us all of the goodness in the world. And leave a comment below about a time when an act of kindness changed your life, or how you've made a difference for someone else. Your story matters. Your kindness matters. Together, we can create a ripple effect that transforms not just lives, but entire communities. And never forget, the smallest gesture can be someone's turning point.